You're carrying a lot. You handle the pressure, you keep the system running, and somewhere along the way, you started believing that carrying the weight meant you were leading. But those aren't the same thing. Leadership isn't maintaining, it's directing. Stability without direction is just controlled drift. The provision asks what needs to be handled, whereas leadership asks where are we going? Provision responds to problems, and leadership creates clarity before problems force it. Your family doesn't just need you to carry the load, they need you to set direction. The Band of Brothers is where men stop confusing provision with leadership. And if that's where you are, you'll know what to do. You're carrying a lot, financially, logistically, and operationally. You're the reason that things don't fall apart. You solve problems, and you handle the pressure, you keep the system running. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that carrying the weight meant you were leading. But those aren't the same thing. It's that confusion that might be costing you more than you realize. So maybe you're thinking, I'm leading by keeping everything stable. But leadership isn't maintaining, it's directing. And while stability is good, but stability without direction is just controlled drift. So you might be thinking, I make hard decisions that keep us afloat. But do you? Or do you make operational decisions? Things on what to fix and what to pay and what to handle next, while avoiding the directional decisions. Directional decisions sound something like, where are we going as a family and what are we building toward? What values are we actually living? And how do we want our kids to remember this very season? So your provider voice might be saying, but I'm setting direction by providing opportunities. But opportunities aren't direction. Opportunities are resources. See, what direction is what do we do with those resources and why do we do this and not that? And what matters most when everything can't matter equally? Maybe thinking, but I'm giving them more than I had. And that's provision. And provision does matter. But your kids don't need more than what you had. What they need is you to lead them towards something that matters. There's a difference between giving them resources and giving them a target. So a question I'd like you to sit with is, when did you start believing that carrying weight meant you were setting direction? Because here's what provision looks like in practice. You handle the income, you manage the logistics, you fix what breaks, and you keep the machine running. People depend on you, and you deliver. That's real, and that matters. But here's what leadership also requires, and this is where most of us providers get quiet. You see, leadership requires clarity under pressure, not just endurance under pressure, but clarity. What matters, what doesn't? Where are we going? What are we willing to sacrifice to get there? See, most providers can endure indefinitely, but they can avoid the clarity conversations because those conversations require more than effort. They're going to require a decision. And decision requires you to take a position. To say, this matters more than that. To prioritize what can't all get prioritized. To risk maybe being wrong about what's important. See, provision doesn't require that. Provision just requires showing up and handling what's right in front of you. Whereas leadership requires setting a standard and not just meeting it. See, provision will meet the standard. It already is. It's paying the bills. It's the responsibilities being covered. It's the system that's functioning. And yet leadership requires us to set standards. This is what we value, and this is what we're building for, and this is what I expect from myself and from us. And so there's a huge difference between maintaining a standard someone else set and actually creating the standard yourself. And see, most providers maintain while leaders, we create. Leaders require presence, not just performance. And so you can provide from a distance. You can solve problems without being emotionally available. You can carry this load without actually being in the environment. And you can be that guy that handles things while remaining fundamentally unaware or unavailable for connection. But you can't lead from distance. Leadership requires you to be in the room, mentally, emotionally, and especially relationally. Not just physical presence while thinking about the next problem to solve. Not just available for logistics, but actually being present for people. See, leadership requires making the hard relational decisions, not just hard operational ones. Operational decisions, we know what those are. It's what to cut from the budget. It's what project to take on, what problem to solve next. These are hard, but they're clear. Whereas relational decisions are more like what conversations need to happen, even though it's uncomfortable. What standards need to be held, even though it creates tension. What needs to be addressed, even though it would be easier to manage around it. You see, these are much harder because they don't have metrics, and most providers are comfortable with operational difficulty. And most providers avoid relational difficulty. And so the question I have for you is, where are you substituting provision for leadership decisions that you've been avoiding? So let me show you what I mean by giving you a few concrete examples. These are the moments where leadership is actually needed, and most providers miss them entirely. So here's the first scenario. Your kid is struggling with something. They're facing a decision or dealing with a friendship issue or uncertain about something that matters to them. They don't need you to fix it. They need you to help them think through it, to ask them questions that help them gain clarity, to be present while they work it out. But here's what happens when you're in provider mode. They bring it up, you hear problem, you respond, solution. Here's what I do. Here's how to handle it. This is what worked for me. And you're thinking, hey, I'm helping. What they needed was leadership, which means helping them develop their own clarity, not giving them yours. Provider mode gives answers, whereas leadership mode is going to ask questions. Provider mode is solving, whereas leadership mode develops. And when you default to provision, you're training them to come to you for answers, not for a process of thinking through hard things. See, that's not leadership. That's just outsourced decision-making. Here's another scenario. Your spouse is facing a decision. It's not a logistical one, but it's a real one. Something that requires clarity about values or priorities or direction, and she brings it to you. And here's what happens when we stay in provider mode. We hear a problem that needs solving. So how do we respond? What do you want to do? Or, I trust your judgment. Or, whatever you think is best. And you think, I'm being supportive. But what she's actually needed was for you to engage her, to help her think through with her, to bring your perspective and not defer to hers, to lead the conversation toward clarity and not avoid taking a position. Leadership doesn't mean making the decision for her. It means being fully present in the process of making the decision. And when you defer, when you avoid taking a position because you don't want to create tension or maybe be wrong, you're not being supportive. You're being absent. So here's another scenario. Your family is drifting. No one's upset, but there's no direction either. Everyone's busy and everyone's handling their responsibilities. But when you step back and you look at it, you're not building toward anything. You're just managing through each week. And so here's what leadership will require for us in that moment. Calling a pause, bringing everyone together, and asking, where are we going? What are we building? And what matters most right now? Not on once a year at some family retreat, but regularly. It's part of the rhythm. But when we get into provider mode, we don't do that, do we? Because there's no crisis forcing it. And if there's no crisis, it kind of feels unnecessary. So we keep providing, keep managing, and we keep solving the next problem. And then the drift continues. Not because we're failing, but because we're confusing effort with direction. So here's a question. What leadership moment did you miss this week because you were in provider mode? So think about that specifically. When did someone need your leadership and you gave them provision instead? And so here's what that looks like in a real conversation. Your spouse brings something up. Maybe it's something relational. It requires your attention. Your instinct right away is, let's solve it. I'm going to fix it. To turn it into a problem that I can handle. what if the conversation isn't about solving? What if it's about leading? And so she says, I feel like we're just managing. And I hear, it's a problem for me to fix. So I say, what do you need? What can I do? Tell me what would help. And you think you're being helpful. But here's what she's actually saying. I need you to set direction. I need to know where we're going. I need leadership, not solutions. She's not asking you to do more. She's asking you to lead more. And leading doesn't mean adding to your task list. It means bringing clarity to what you're already doing. But you default to provision because provision is what you know how to do. Because provision has clear actions. Provision doesn't require us to take a vulnerable position. And so here's another example. She comes to you and she says, I don't know if we're making the right call with the kids' college education. And so you respond, I think we're fine. Let's just see how it plays out. Or what to do, or what do you think we should do? Both responses really avoid leadership. The first one deflects to uncertainty, and the second one defers the decision. What leadership would sound like is, let's talk through it. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what concerns me. What are you seeing? Let's get clear on what matters most here, and let's make a decision together. See, that's engagement. That's presence. That's leadership. But it requires you to enter the uncertainty with her, not avoid it by deferring or deflecting. And so here's another scenario. Your kid comes to you with something they're struggling with, and you respond, here's how to handle it. Here's what I'll do. Try this. Again, we're back to provision, resources, and solutions. What they might actually need is your presence and attention, and to be seen and not fixed. To process it with you, not to receive your solution. But we default to provision because that's the language that we speak, and because that's what feels like we're helping. And because being present without solving feels like we're just not doing anything. But it's not nothing. It's leadership. Leadership is staying in the room even when there's no clear problem to solve. And leadership is being present for the process, not just the outcome. Leadership is helping people develop clarity, not giving them ours. So question, what conversations are you turning into problems to solve when they're actually invitations to lead? And what would change if you stopped trying to solve and started trying to lead? So here's what happens over time when provision replaces leadership. People stop bringing things to you that can't be solved. They stop sharing what they're thinking, and they stop asking for direction because they've learned you respond with resources, not clarity. And so, of course, they adapt. Your spouse builds a life that doesn't require your leadership because your leadership just isn't available. Your kids learn to look elsewhere for direction because you're too busy providing to actually guide. Your team at home learns that you're the problem solver and not the direction setter. And you don't notice because everyone is still functioning. The bills are paid and the system's working. But leadership has quietly exited the building. And what's left is a well-managed life with no clear direction. And so question, what is it like to live in an environment where provision is present, but leadership is absent? See, provision asks what needs to be handled, whereas leadership asks, where are we going? Provision responds to problems, and leadership creates clarity before problems force it. Provision works harder, and leadership, it decides what matters. Provision is effort, while leadership becomes direction. You don't need to provide less, you need to lead more. And leading more doesn't require more time, it requires a different attention. It requires being in the room when you're in the room. And it requires making directional decisions, not just operational ones. And it requires presence, not just performance. And so, question, what would change if you brought the same intentionality to leadership that you bring to provision? So here's what serious men understand. The provision is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You can provide for a family and still fail them as a leader. Not because you're working hard enough, but because you've confused effort with direction. Most men don't realize they've made this trade until someone names it. You've traded leadership for the appearance of responsibility. And you've traded presence for performance. You've traded clarity for endurance. But it's not maturity. It's substitution. Maturity would be recognizing the difference and closing that gap. You're providing. No one's going to question that. But provision without leadership is just well-managed drift. And drift doesn't become direction just because you're working hard. The question isn't whether you're doing enough. The question is whether you're leading or just carrying weight. Because those aren't the same things. And your family doesn't just need you to carry the load, they need you to set direction. The Band of Brothers is where men stop confusing provision with leadership. And if that's where you are, you'll know what to do.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is the Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.